Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
I think that Banu's invocation of Toni Morrison's category of re-memory is a really beautiful segue into this next panel, where we'll have some very specific instances of re-memory. This panel is titled Rooted Resistance, Plants, Colonial Histories, and Radical Futures. And I am very excited to finally welcome to the stage my friend, colleague, and co-conspirator, Natalia Schveen-Scott, to moderate and introduce this panel. We've been talking about the composite nature of being throughout this conference, and I will say Natalia is a planet. She is a universe. She herself is an herbalist, a wildlife rescue and rehabilitation apprentice, and a PhD student in the study of religion here at Harvard University. She researches relational ontologies, post-human ethics, and diction on personhood in scientific discourse, specifically neuroscience. Her secondary degree is in Celtic languages and literatures, where she explores trans-species soul migration and the role of plant in Old Irish mythology and Scottish Gaelic folklore. In addition to her doctoral work, she's had a range of research and administrative roles here at Harvard. She's associate director of Harvard Divinity School's Program for the Evolution of Spirituality. She has led the Interspecies Dialogue, which is a fantastic ongoing group here for many years, which regularly features a variety of scholars, writers, scientists, filmmakers, and animacy practitioners. And finally, she and I co-launched this initiative humbly several years ago. It began as a reading group, which many of you have asked to join, which is delightful. And it has now blossomed into this initiative, which she serves as advisor and program associate for. There's much more about Natalia that I won't have time to touch on, but I'm so excited to welcome her here to the stage to offer her words and moderate this rich conversation. So welcome, Natalia.
Good morning, everyone. What a beautiful and nourishing few days this has been. I am so grateful to have the opportunity to share in these conversations with you, both our speakers and our guests. Thank you all for being here. Quickly, thank you, Rachel, so much for your, where'd you go? Oh, there you go. For your thoughtfulness and your fearless leadership. I'm so grateful to have you as a friend and a colleague. Thank you to Elitza and Russ, my wonderful, brilliant teammates in the Thinking with Plants and Fungi initiative. And thank you to the Center for the Study of World Religions, to the director, Charles Stang, and to our wonderful team there, including our dear Lori, Isabel, and Sarah, whose steady kindness is a gift to our community. Thank you. Most of us in the room here are here as visitors or settlers on land which has served as a site of meeting and exchange among many indigenous peoples of Turtle Island since time immemorial. Harvard University is located on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. I will also note that a land acknowledgement is not enough. Without active allyship, which means including and prioritizing Indigenous presences and Indigenous voices, it is performative and an empty statement. Our next panel will continue on the theme of colonial power and plants, but turn us towards a consideration of language and interpretation. As many of you already know, and Rachel so kindly mentioned, in the fall of 2022, we were asked by Charles Stang to lead a reading group on plant consciousness at the Center for the Study of World Religions. Rachel and I quickly realized that we were relatively ambivalent about the term consciousness itself, and as we have found in many of our readings, it is often used interchangeably with sentience, mind, agency, not always with clarity on what those terms mean. Yet our readings also demonstrated that to many cultures across the globe, whether or not plants are conscious in the post-Christian sense of that word, this is not an issue. Instead, the terminology focused on relationships. Our interdisciplinary community over the last 3 years has navigated together through scientific papers alongside books coming out of critical plant studies, arguments that question human exceptionalism, and articles on decolonial approaches to personhood and ethics. We've joked that instead of going into a lab or a field site and accidentally finding God, we all came into a divinity school and accidentally found science. I offer this as a way to set the scene. I've been tracing a theme not only in our conversations over the past few days, but throughout the last 3 years of our biweekly gatherings. Data and the interpretive lens through which we consider and present that data are different things. Interpretive lenses are culturally rooted and, dare I say, often theologically informed. Echoing Banu's comment this morning, my argument is very similar. It's all religion. In their 2018 article, "If Indigenous People Stand with the Scientists, with Sciences, Will Scientists Stand with Us?" Ojibwe scholar Megan Bang, along with Ananda Marin and Douglas Medin, called for a heterogeneity of sciences. They write that, quote, "Skeptics of Indigenous sciences frequently assert that non-Western ways of knowing do not aim for objectivity or are incapable of achieving objective knowledge," end quote. They go on to argue that objectivity cannot and should not be equated with value neutrality, and then ask us to consider, quote, "whose values, whose knowledge systems are accepted as legitimate in a multicultural and multi-epistemological world," end quote. While our 4 speakers may not all focus explicitly on indigeneity or consciousness, each address the ways we world build through interpretation. Put simply, data never speaks for itself. It is always presented through philosophical entanglements or embranglements, as Banu said. If we fail to recognize those underlying commitments, we cannot meaningfully begin to support a more equitable world or a truly decolonized heterogeneity of sciences or the humanities. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker. Thank you for listening to me rant. Elaine Ayers is a lecturer in the history of science and medicine at Yale University and holds a PhD in the history of science from Princeton University. Her work focuses on the entangled histories of botany, colonial violence, and collecting in the 18th and 19th centuries. Her work has been supported by NEH, NSF, and the New York Botanical Garden, among others, and she consults at museums and gardens on repatriation strategies. She's a contributing editor at the Public Domain Review, and her book manuscript explores the history of tropical botany alongside racial, sexual, and gendered lines. Join me in welcoming Elaine to the stage. Thank you.
So thanks so much for having me, and hopefully this is a good follow-up to Banu's talk this morning. Writing from the midst of the Amazonian rainforest in Ecuador in June of 1857, British botanist Richard Spruce, plagued by a deep depression, lingering exhaustion, and reoccurrence of his lifelong illness during his 15-year expedition, found himself in, quote, "the most mossy place he had seen yet anywhere." In a region typically characterized by charismatic palm trees, brightly colored blooms, and economically valuable plants that so interested colonial collectors during the 19th century, Spruce found reason to thank heaven, which had enabled me to forget for the moment all my troubles in the contemplation of a simple moss. Spruce, often called a botanist's botanist because of his extreme attention to minute detail and meticulous record-keeping, had indeed trained his eyes on such small, mundane bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, in his home of Yorkshire, where these often unpopular, decidedly unshowy plants flourished in the colder, damp climate. Coming across his beloved bryophytes in the Amazon renewed Spruce not just with a sense of nostalgia or the promise of prolific collections, but reminded the botanist of the simplicity and commonplaceness of God's creations at work in what he considered a sensorially overwhelming rainforest, as in his humble British home alike. Assembling the British botanist's notes years after his death for publication, naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace pointed to this exact moment of mossy meditation as a point of rededication to his expedition, a physical and spiritual resurrection that allowed spruce to keep going in the service of empire. Spruce was indeed able to keep going, now typically remembered for his more sensationalist act of botanical espionage in transporting highly valuable cinchona saplings, carefully wrapped in moss, while wearing brown face, out of the Andes alongside Clements Markham a few years later, fueling settler imperialism in South and Southeast Asia for over a century. Spruce maintained his focus on bryophytes throughout his expedition and beyond, largely forsaking economic botany in favor of his beloved mosses and liverworts. While few other colonial botanists wrote explicitly and at such length about mosses and other bryophytes in the late 18th and 19th centuries, those who did held these tiny plants in very high regard, often viewing them as concrete proof of God's design and perhaps as evidence of their own sharp eyes that favored intricacy over showiness. Mosses occupied an odd place within botany, even outside of the colonial field. Awkwardly lumped into Carl Linnaeus' 24th category in his Systema Naturae, bryophytes and other spore-reproducing organisms, ranging from slime molds and fungi to tree ferns and lichen, became categorized as cryptogamia, plants that married or reproduced secretly. And we've been laughing about these metaphors of marriage, sex, and divorce this week, but it's worth remembering, as Banu just noted, that this language was very explicitly used, not just to describe, but to categorize plants, well through the 19th century and arguably still today. Understudied and misunderstood, cryptogamic reproduction stoked ideas ranging from spontaneous generation to a vitalist internal drive, landing these small, simple plants as simultaneously first and most primitive in theories of floral development, and last as mere afterthought in the larger botanical context. I won't try to recount the entire history of 18th and 19th century work on mosses and other bryophytes in this very short talk. You'll have to read my book for that if I ever finish it. Questionable. Which range from practical uses of these plants in global shipping and preservation to the development of specious ideas about racial primitivity to metaphoric accounts of these damp, secretive organisms in Victorian pornography. Rather, I'll focus in on lots of good porn stuff here. I'll focus in on a couple of moments of mossy contemplation in the midst of times of turmoil for colonial botanists, working at sometimes quite painful crossroads, questioning how one of the most commonplace plants found growing on every continent and equally in the cracks of city streets as in Arctic climates, in rainforests and in the pastures of northern Britain, was used as a devotional object of sorts to define the art and science of close observation while providing inspiration for resurrection across climates and environments, fueling empire in often horrific ways. Much can be said about using moss as a metaphor for radical thought, from anti-capitalism and community building to queer and even asexual reproduction, and I'm of course happy to think more about this, but it's worth questioning the colonial context in which some of these ideas were built and hardened and restricted and refined. Even in often violent periods of colonial rule and strict articulations of gender binaries and sexual limitations, mosses have sown their spores freely and provocatively, defying Western systems of categorization, bodily boundedness, and even the definition of life itself, offering pious and devotional possibility in the contemplation of a simple moss. So Richard Spruce was far from the only colonial explorer saved by a mossy encounter while traveling in the fields. Moving through Western Africa in the 1790s under the African Association, widely credited for beginning in earnest the incredibly violent age of African exploration and sponsored by the famous Sir Joseph Banks, Scottish naturalist Mungo Park found himself similarly broken down physically and mentally. Finding himself, quote, in the midst of a vast wilderness, Park wrote, in the depth of the rainy season, naked and alone, I don't think he was naked or alone, surrounded by savage animals and men still more savage, I was indeed a stranger in a strange land. Yet I was still under the protective eye of that Providence who is condescended to call himself the stranger's friend. At this moment, painful as my reflections were, the extraordinary beauty of a small moss in fructification irresistibly caught my eye. I mention this, he wrote, to show from what trifling circumstances the mind will sometimes derive consolation. For though the whole plant was no larger than the top of one of my fingers, I could not contemplate the delicate conformation of its roots, leaves, and capsules without admiration. Oop, this is not where it should be. we'll go here. Remembering his botanical training, Park, like Spruce, collected this small moss, a specimen of Physidens now housed at the New York Botanical Garden. It's hard to see because it's folded up here. There's a little illustration as well, where Spruce's moss that he collected also coincidentally lives, and dried it, labeled it, shipped it back to the herbarium, neatly calling his object of divine inspiration while affixing it to paper for further study. Rather than allowing the moss to continue growing for further admiration or certainly for its own purposes, Park's idea of consolation required ordering and possession. His own story of adventure and piousness in this vast wilderness, well populated by people despite his assertions, sold incredibly widely to readers back home, and this passage was quoted ad nauseum in texts throughout the 19th century, including in Spruce's. That Spruce and Park would react in such a similar way to a mossy encounter in the field was no coincidence. Both worked within a growing tradition of devotional botanical collecting and observational training starting from a very early age, even working with some of the same botanists who sent out and funded naturalists as part of the colonial mission in the service of empire. Too much probably has been written about Joseph Banks's role in fueling a botanical empire out of his Soho Square quarters for the Linnaean Society, but less immediately prominent botanists like the Scottish horticulturalist James Dixon, botanist James Edward Smith, and William Jackson Hooker, who went on to become the first director of Kew, often set their sights originally on smaller cryptogamic plants that held less immediate economic value. These men, and sometimes women, some of whom would go on to hold very significant positions like Hooker in shaping the field of 19th century colonial botany, often sought out, funded, and brokered collectors who had honed their skills closer to home, demonstrating careful observational practices and attention to literally microscopic detail. Indeed, Spruce established himself as a reputable collector as early as the age of 12, not because of his wealth or his social standing. He grew up very working class and never attended university, but because of his early local taxonomic publications around Yorkshire. Even Hooker studied cryptogams first and foremost, consulting on a rare moss with James Edward Smith before embarking on an expedition to Iceland, where he studied bryophytes like Physidens, Youngermania, and Hypnum, of, quote, so delicate in nature that it was scarcely possible, even with the utmost care, to bring any of them away perfect. Nevertheless, he did bring the bryophytes with him, not so perfectly, most of which now live at Kew in the New York Botanical Garden, colonial institutions to the highest degree. Precisely because of their simplicity, lack of visible reproductive organs, and certainly their widespread local availability in Britain and surrounding areas, bryophytes represented pious, polite objects of study for women and working class men alike. While women collected mosses and other small mundane proofs of the divine in nature while practicing skills like illustration, needlepoint embroidery, and garden design in the early 19th century, artisan botanists trained in the practices of scientific observation while discussing their findings and sharing resources at local pubs, which Anne Secord has written about beautifully, serves as a reminder that maybe some of our best work happens locally, socially, in conversation, and over beer. While botany, like so many other scientific fields, masculinized, professionalized, and specialized in the 19th century, the study of mosses remained relatively open, a local devotional way of cutting one's teeth, maybe one's peristomes, in microscopic observation while proving one's worth to naturalists with collections. And bryophytic identification, collection, and classification is indeed an intricate, close act of observation and skill. While some basic differentiations can be made by sight alone or under a hand lens without too much difficulty, and some fructifications are more immediately visible than others, the art of looking at moss is a lesson in attention, noticing, looking, something increasingly rare in our attention-starved world. Regardless of religious beliefs used as justification for colonization, indeed I'm not including much of the really specious language that these men used to describe the indigenous laborers who literally carried them and their mosses through rainforests and across mountains and glaciers. That's part of the book project. It's perhaps unsurprising that men like Park and Spruce found meditative, nostalgic, godly moments when encountering moss in the middle of forests, years into their colonial expeditions filled with injury, illness, exhaustion, and violence that they themselves perpetuated, even if we choose to forget about it now. To look at something so small, so perfectly designed, is to connect to something outside of oneself, to find inspiration in ubiquity and delicacy. If you speak to a bryologist now, they often sort of go starry-eyed, mossy-eyed for a moment, wrapped in the viridescent beauty of their subjects and the paradoxical complexity and vast range of color, morphology, ciliation, tiny teeths of mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And that rapture seems particularly important now as botanical garden administrators, sadly, argue for increased use of AI in recognizing patterns and forming classifications across herbarium collections, to say nothing of the environmental impacts of AI. Resurrection, though, happened across multiple scales, from the microscopic, indeed, to the massive, global, imperial, on every continent for centuries. Moss conjured ideas of resurrection and pious study not just because of its smallness and simplicity of form, it also held fascination for botanists because of its confounding reproduction and life cycles. Not only did bryophytes seemingly spring up invisibly in what they considered to be inhospitable environments, they launched a series of experiments in the late 18th and early 19th centuries into moss's microscopic mechanisms for sexual and asexual reproduction. But moss also sometimes comes back to life after long periods of apparent death or dormancy, challenging the idea of the beginnings and endings of life among such organisms, indeed about the very nature of life itself. Botanists like Johann Hedwig, I don't know which slides are showing up and which aren't, sorry. Okay. Johann Hedwig had experimented with cryptogamic dissection across the 18th century at the Leipzig Botanical Gardens, studying bryophytes' tiny sex organs using jeweler's tools, which you can see here. He sort of put himself into the picture, tweezers, a loop, a hand lens, to delineate and classify hundreds of species of mosses. Others puzzled over cryptogamic mechanisms for sowing their invisible seeds, sometimes called dust, at sites like the Jamaica Botanic Garden, a garden originally built by enslaved people designed for acclimatization and fueling future generations of enslavement. The humidity of Jamaica's climate, often a death knell for dried and pressed herbarium plants, which quickly molded and rotted, produced growth from seemingly dead cryptogams within a fortnight, even when impregnation seemingly did not occur. Launching a flurry of investigations into this seeming moisture-driven spontaneous generation, mosses and other cryptogams were used to debate reproduction and its discontents by the early to mid-19th century. One of these botanists was James Drummond, a Scottish botanist and gardener. After conducting experiments and introducing rainwater to ground up long-dead specimens of Funaria hygrometrica at the Cork Botanical Garden, noting that on the 7th day, the moss's peristomes, first described by Hedwig, appeared on plates of glass as if covered with green velvet, Drummond embarked into the field to observe this germination in action. Leaving for the colonial Swan River colony in Western Australia in 1828 amid an economic recession and with an enormous family to support, the botanist sought to establish a garden and a network of collectors in the hot and dry climate, an environment not immediately fruitful for moss. Drummond was shocked then to see his beloved Funaria hygrometrica, also pressed and dried here, because you have to collect it, right? Seemingly desiccated and rare, return, as it were, to the charge with every shower of rain, speculating that the moss's powers of resurrection proved why it could be found growing, quote, all over the globe, whether the countries have risen from the sea, the work of insects, or been ejected in the form of burning lava through the bowels of the earth. Something that it sounds like maybe Merlin is intimately familiar with. He was amazed to see such life, and particularly life so nostalgically connected to him, to his home back in Scotland and then in Ireland, springing from far and apparently dried up soils and rocks. This minute moss, he wrote, is not only beautiful in itself, but it also served as an admirable illustration of the subject which it cost him much trouble to elucidate many years ago. The idea that life could exist out of dried, ground-up dust, out of apparently inert soil, out of seemingly dead specimens in Frankensteinian ways, was foundational to complex theories about vitalism, pre-evolutionary transformationism, and internal drives within organisms that occupied imaginations in the late 18th and 19th century colonial natural history, while fueling debates about the inevitability and longevity of enslavement and empire. Winding its way through conversations about the age of the earth, plant transportation, colonial environments, and more, cryptogamic reproduction not only challenged but fueled ideas of what constituted the nature of life in ways that rippled far beyond botany. For many biologists, these strange mossy qualities informed philosophical, religious, and existential debates about their own bodies, minds, and motivations, all the while justifying, not just metaphorically, racial and sexual categorization with very long-term consequences. These are like completely out of order at this point. Decades after James Drummond wrote about moss being beautiful in itself, and years after returning to his home in Yorkshire from his expedition through South America, Richard Spruce found himself again contemplating the meaning of his tiny subjects and perhaps his own purpose in life. Suffering from debilitating headaches and blurred vision that limited his microscopic study to 20 minutes at a time while his teeth slowly fell out, he joked that he was becoming one of his mossy specimens, counting the number of teeth left in his head. The botanist reflected the nature of his work. "I like to look upon plants as sentient beings," he wrote, his typically very beautiful, neat handwriting shaking, "which live and enjoy their lives, which beautify the earth during life and after death may adorn my herbarium. When they're beaten to a pulp or powder in the apothecary's mortar, they lose most of their interest to me. They are at least useful to and beautiful in themselves, surely the primary motive of individual existence." While Spruce would be remembered after his death as an exemplary botanist whose collections, and especially bryophytic collections, formed the foundations of most of our colonial herbaria, within his lifetime he saw very little success, or certainly financial appreciation, unlike flashier colonizers like his former colleagues Sir Clements Markham or even Mungo Park. His pious and scientific devotion to mosses was underappreciated, a reflection perhaps of his desire to produce something beautiful to himself. While moss occupied an outsized place for its minuscule form in the history of botany, forming a field of polite and Christian study, driving questions of reproduction and resurrection, and offering spiritual resurrection to explorers in the field, it simply didn't possess the charisma of brightly colored and economically valuable plants like orchids, palms, and cinchona. I'll just wrap up here. Historian of science Lirian Daston has pointed to the rift between cryptogamic and phanerogamic botanists in her evocative description of the Blashka glass flowers that many of us had the privilege of drinking wine alongside the other night, housed at Harvard's Natural History Museum. While that messy, massive Linnaean category of spore-reproducing plants was vitally important because of its primitivity, again, both predating and postdating other floral life within the Book of Nature, the divide between ways of seeing separated and perhaps continues to separate botanists. By the late 19th century, Daston argues, cryptogamists felt that, quote, flowers had come to symbolize the exoteric, the superficial, the epistemologically shallow, and the screamingly obvious. They lacked the depth and difficulty that signified taste and truth. Recalling the devotion and dedication, both religious and scientific, involved in training observation on one of the simplest, most perfect forms of plants, this claim calls for us to think not just about plants and fungi, but about how different types of plants and fungi have inspired such different forms of study, of practice, and of inspiration across centuries. Some constructed sense of purity, born out of moss's simplicity, closely concealed reproduction, smallness, and lack of vulgar sensationalism, drew pious reflection and meditation, even as we now view these tiny organisms as indicative of so much radical queer possibility. So we forget sometimes when using these mossy ways of thinking that many such perspectives were necessarily built on an extractive, colonizing Christian tradition. While meditative for themselves, these botanists removed their mosses from their environments, setting them against white paper and sending them to the herbarium where Latin names would be applied to them for filing. This is an uncomfortable tension for us to sit with, that even in these moments of pious meditative reflection, plants have and likely always will be used to affirm our own anthropomorphized ideas of what it means to, in this case, be resurrected, or to find our primary motives of individual existence, while we continue to strip them from their homes and force them into systems of classification for human use value. Scholars like Robin Wall-Kimmerer have, of course, offered alternative models for thinking about mosses and other plants. So many people in this room have. And there have been many incredible examples this week of thinking about plants as necessarily anti-colonial. But the foundations of most of our disciplinary work in herbaria, botany, botanical gardens, well-funded conferences, and publications such as these were indeed born out of colonial and religious violence and reductionism, in which plants work to serve our own ends, offering metaphors often divorced from their own mossy realities. So reattaching the colonial history of this line of metaphorical thinking, I would hope, perhaps, can offer lessons in our own contemplations and meditations, reminding us of the groundedness and the history of our field of study that is, after all, very far from new. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That was wonderful. All right, so I have the pleasure of introducing our next two speakers. And for our next presentation, our speakers will be joined by Claudio, who will be translating for us today, just as a heads up. So we ask that our audience be patient as translation takes time. Okay, so Rebecca Mendoza's research focuses on indigenous religious traditions of the Americas with a focus on pre-colonial and decolonial theory grounded in Mexico and the contemporary borderlands of Mexico and the US broadly. She's a current PhD student in the Committee for the Study of Religion. Broadly, her scholarship centers on indigenous ontologies, material religion, and ritual survivance. Her interdisciplinary approach bridges ancient Mesoamerican materials and cosmovision with contemporary indigenous, Mexican, and Chicanx communities. Rebecca graduated from Harvard Divinity School with an MDiv and the University of Oregon with a BA. She was a 2022 summer pre-Columbian fellow at Dumbarton Oaks and a graduate student associate at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. And in 2023, she was awarded the Ford Pre-Doctoral Fellowship. Sabina Cruz de la Cruz is from Tacomete, Chicontepec, Veracruz, and she is a native speaker of Nahuatl language. She's a Nahuatl language and culture instructor at the University of Los Angeles, California. She works at the Institute of Teaching and Ethnological Research in Zacatecas, where she also participates as an instructor in Zacatecas. She graduated from the Autonomous University of Zacatecas with a law degree and holds a master's in historical education. She is a Nahuatl language instructor in the Department of Anthropology at Tulane University in New Orleans and has worked as a Nahuatl instructor in other spaces as well, including Lila's Benson Department at the University of Texas. She is the author of an article in Ethnohistory Journal, A Village Healer, translated from Nahuatl to English in 2019. She participated in the translation and research of the Florentine Codex book at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, and her research focuses on traditional medicine, and she has participated in ethnohistory conferences across the US and at LASA. Welcome to the stage, Sabina and Rebecca. Thank you.
I'm so delighted to be here with all of you today and to contribute some of the strange and wonderful stuff of religious studies alongside my friend and colleague, Natalia. I'm deeply grateful to be accompanied and guided by my teacher and collaborator, Tlamachtiket Sabina, Tlaskamati Sabina. We've heard many words in Latin, and now we're going to hear some in Nahuatl. Thank you, Natalia, for reforming your mouth, working on these sounds that may not be familiar to us. I was first greeted by copal as it burned, fragrant, ephemeral billows of white smoke against the blue skies of Denver, Colorado. I witnessed the woman danzante holding copal as she bent down to kiss the earth. I later learned that Spanish colonizers had recorded this ritual when they arrived in the Yucatan. This act, translated as eating the earth, is a way of making agreements. To be trusted and trustworthy, we too can humbly kiss the earth. We ask permiso to Copali, Copalcuahuitl, to our ancestors and to this place, the lands of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag. Asking for permission is a way of knowing through good relations, and like protocol, a term used by many indigenous communities, it's a path not purely of prohibition, although that's often part of the deal, but also a practice of caretaking and protection. So we invite you to ask permission in your own way. For us, thinking with copal means not only about copal, it means that knowledge exists within the relationship. There are quite a few things published and a lot of things that one can know about copal. For instance, that it's an aromatic tree resin, primarily harvested for incense from various species of the Persera genus, which grow across Mexico and Central America, as those names are used today. Most information published about copal includes its chemical compounds, its effects on rats' anxiety in the lab, mapping its location in archaeological surveys, and even where it's bought and sold in contemporary markets. And all of that is very important, and I do not mean to suggest that these researchers are not also thinking with copal, but rarely is that level of engagement at the heart of the academic knowledge production. Sometimes one chapter, one paragraph mentions the religious significance or how communities use copal. So what do we learn when we sit with, when we smell copal and we refuse to dissect it, at least without permission? That being said, for us, copal is an ancestral teacher. Durable, enduring, ephemeral, dynamic. Copal accompanies us. Sabina and I have tried to describe the smell. And as Sean had pointed out, we oftentimes look for comparisons. It's like pine, a bit of citrus, earthy, clean. But maybe our inability to explain a smell is not so much the failure of language as much as it is an indicator of our proximity. Brian Burkhart, a Lakota philosopher, warns against concepts that float free from the ground. He speaks about knowledge which comes from epistemic locality, a teaching from the trickster spider Iktomi. If copal becomes abstracted or dislocalized, a thing, we can export certain types of knowledge to a certain degree, but the reality is neither Sabina or I know how to tell you how copal smells. Informally put, if you know, you know. And we do invite you to come and smell copal later if you're interested in that proximity. In this talk, we'll refer to copal as a verb. In Nahuatl, popochuia. In Spanish, copalear. In English, to copal, to smudge, to apply smoke to someone or something. Also, as I've learned from Sabina, copal is yeso cuauhitl, the blood of trees. Copal is blood, not like blood, and what we call the bark is petlayotlen cuauhitl, the skin of the tree. And we can't be too quick to call this anthropomorphism, because Mesoamerican humans were made out of maize. Furthermore, the pre-colonial Mesoamerican earth is a body, but not necessarily a human body. In fact, the earth was painted, sculpted, and described as a monstrous mother with open jaws and claws, like Taltecutli, and at other times, a Cipactli, a primordial crocodilian being floating on the water. Or as Tlazolteotl, one I think you all will like, a goddess of compost and decay, a force for filth and fertility, a source of sexuality and soil. Copal has long been offered to the sky, ascending as smoke and descending into watery underworlds, to be consumed by deities. Copal was also consumed by humans in teas placed in the teeth, maybe to help with dental health or to give you fresh breath, but also because the breath, the song, the smells, and smoke are ways of transferring power between different bodies and beings. And copal also consumes us in smoke. It leaves a trace in sensors and sticks to the skin of trees and humans alike. In fact, I've been stuck with copali, quite literally, in my hands. And to my knowledge, my commitment to copal began with encountering a problematic collection of over 100 fragments taken from the Mayas cenote sagrado that now lives in the Harvard Peabody Museum, just around the corner from here. I've written about this elsewhere, so I won't get into it, but I want to draw our attention to the fact that copal is museumified since the early 20th century and continues to be objectified in what Brett Hendrickson has called the new spiritual marketplace. So while we listen to Sabina, I hope we're haunted by the incommensurability of enmeshed indigenous ontologies and the encyclopedic colonial collecting and mass market demand for purification at the cost of sacred and ancient relationships with plants such as sage, palo santo, and copal. In fact, copal is integral to a dynamic cosmos of life and death forces and defies our categories. And so we think with this resin that bleeds and burns, that heals at the living and accompanies the dead, as an offering for the gods which maintains its scent even after 500 years buried beneath Mexico City. It remained intact in the cenotes, gluing together assemblages of rubber, greenstone, and shells. And copaleros, the humans who harvest the resin from Bursera trees, have developed intimate relationships for generations. And we can know also that insects partake in this a little bit as well. They create homes from a mix of copal and sometimes the bark and dirt. So the humans sing and pray to the trees, and they ask permission to cut into their flesh and draw from their life force. In some regions, when maguey is still available, they'll use the leaves, the penca, to collect the resin. Here you see that in the work of Margarito Tajonar Pilego de los Sauces, Morelos, Mexico. He works with over 150 trees, and he does not go among the copal trees with bad thoughts. He speaks with cariño and encourages the trees on his camino. Copal is part of a cycle of renewal that is taken seriously through ritual reciprocity. Just as the tree bleeds into the maguey, Humans have also used the spiky maguey for their own bloodletting and ceremonies of sacrifice. So I imagine that humans and trees have long bled together, sacrificed together. They smell one another's blood and flesh, messily enmeshed. So I want to now pass the mic to Sabina with plenty of time so that she can share the significance of copal from her lived and ongoing relationship. Thank you.
Buenos días. Bueno, primero que nada, Piali, Nano toca Sabina Cruz de la Cruz. Mi nombre es Sabina Cruz de la Cruz. Bueno, la continuación del copal es más un uso muy importante en la Huasteca veracruzana, de donde soy originaria. La comunidad, el tecomate, está situada en el municipio de Chicontepec, en el estado de Veracruz. Tecomate es una comunidad náhuatl que viene del vocablo náhuatl, xicali, fruto del jícaro, las jícaras o tecomates, que son recipientes con un significado cosmológico ligado a algunos mitos que aluden a su característica natural, fruto con semillas abundante. Sí, sí.
Before anything else, good morning, and thank you for having me here and have my study and have my conversation about copal today. So I'm original for the community of El Tecomate, which is located in the Chicontepec municipality in the state of Veracruz. Tecomate is a Nahua community. It comes from the Nahua word xicali, which means fruit from the gourd. Which were the chicaras or tecomates are containers with a cosmological significance linked to some myths that allude to the natural characteristics of it, being a fruit with many seeds. Having this fruit in the plant it was used mainly as an object for different things, as spoons, rattles, containers, and all the different things.
Bueno, el tener este fruto de la planta se centraba con el que se elaboran objetos como cucharas, sonajas, vasijas, entre otros productos. ¿Sí? Sí.
I'm sorry, I went a little too far ahead. My apologies.
Okay.
I'm just as excited as everyone else. Sí, estoy emocionada como todos.
Conociendo el copal, para mí, me hizo recordar que cuando era niña, que cada domingo por las mañanas mi mamá y mi papá sacaban la brasa del tlixictli, el fogón, y lo ponían en el popochcomil, copalera o sahumador. Después en el altar le ponían una pequeña porción de copal o incienso. Todo el tiempo lo tenían en el altar. Después empezaban a copalear y así me enseñaron. Yo sentí algo muy hermoso haciéndolo porque me gustaba cómo huele el copal. El percibir su aroma es algo inexplicable y así fui participando en casa con ellos y también en casa de mis abuelos paternos cuando los visitaba.
No, on the copal. When I was a little girl, I remember going every Sunday morning with my dad and my mom to take the burner, which she called tlisicli, and we would put in the popochcomtli, right?
Popochcomil.
Later at the altar, we will put a small portion of copal, and all the time while it was on the altar, and then we will begin to copal, as that's the best way to describe it in Spanish, in English, and that's how they taught me to do that. And I will feel something very beautiful doing all this because I like how the copal smells. I will perceive its aroma as something really difficult to explain, and that's how I began to participate with them and all of that with my grandparents when I will go to visit them.
Luego, cuando crecí, iba con mis abuelitos a la capilla o la iglesia católica del pueblo, a misa o a un rosario donde también usan el copal hasta la actualidad, y se sentía el olor o una energía positiva y animadora. En general es lo que siento al oler el copal, una paz, una energía positiva. Pienso o imagino que todo saldrá bien y que vendrán cosas mejores. Desde entonces uso el copal en mi casa con mi familia.
Later, when I was a little older, I would go with my grandparents to the chapel, which was the Catholic church in my town. We would go to mass there, and in a rosary, when they will also use the copal, and you will feel the smell. It felt like it was a positive energy, and it was uplifting. And generally, that's what I feel when I smell the copal. It's a peace and a positive energy. I feel and imagine that everything's going to go well and better things will come. Ever since I've been using copal at home with my family.
Cuando se toca el copal con las manos, en especial cuando está fresco, se queda en las manos un olor más fuerte por el fresco que está. Al venderlos están envueltos en hojas de maíz, como lo mostramos aquí. Es una costumbre antigua de nuestros abuelos que hacían para guardarlo y secarlo al natural y la resina se endurece. Cuando alguien nunca ha olido este aroma, le va a gustar porque es como si recibiera una energía, un aire diferente y nuevo.
When you touch the copal with your hands, especially when it's fresh, it sticks to your hand with a very strong smell. They are sold wrapped in corn leaves, which is the traditional way of doing it that our grandparents used to do to store it and to naturally harvest it and to allow the resin to harden. For those that have never smelled it, it's something that you're gonna like because it's as if you were receiving an energy, a different kind of sense, like a different air, something new, something strong that just comes into you.
Bueno, aquí el término para el copal o el uso del copal usamos el término malhuili como algo sagrado delicado al realizar una ceremonia o un trabajo. Es decir, que no lo hace cualquier persona. Si lo hace como cualquier persona o que no le corresponde, nada más para, sí, como un trabajo, ganar dinero. A veces tiene consecuencias o como un castigo, vamos a decir. Aquí lo importante es que la persona que lo hace es que tenga fe o también tenga ese don de realizar el trabajo usando el copal. También se hace el pedir permiso a los lugares o como elementos sagrados, como en los cerros, fuego, el agua, la tierra y a los dioses, dependiendo del trabajo que se va a realizar.
So now we want to introduce a word that is malhuili, which is a word that means something sacred. It is when you work with the copal, that's the word that you use. It's and when it's something delicate to, when you use the copal within a ceremony, within a work, which means that not anyone can do this. And this is based on specifically, we're talking about people that do it just to make a profit, because it can have consequences when you do that. And so what I'm trying to say is that you have to have faith in order to work with the copal. And in order to do that, you're expected to ask for permission to the sacred elements around us, whether it's a hill, a mountain, fire, water, earth, and the gods. And it all depends on what kind of work you're doing, while you use the copal.
Bueno, en las comunidades indígenas antes y en la actualidad se realizan ceremonias y el curanderismo donde el copal siempre está presente. Por mencionar algunos, tenemos la petición de lluvia, lavamanos, baño del bebé, Día de Muertos, y para la medicina tradicional o el curanderismo usan el humo del copal para barrer las malas energías del cuerpo o de espacio, acompañados de rezos y cantos dependiendo del trabajo que se realice.
In the indigenous communities, in the old times and as well as now, we have ceremonies and the healer activities are present there. That's where copal is always present in those ceremonies. Just to mention a few, we ask for rain. We ask for spiritual washing. We also when we wash our babies. On the Day of the Dead, it's also an important ceremony to use that. And in the traditional medicine or the healers, is used. We use the copal smoke to get rid of bad vibes, bad energies in the body, and also it's accompanied by prayers and chants, depending on what work are you doing with the copal at that specific ceremony.
En esta imagen es la ceremonia de petición de lluvia. Esta ceremonia es para pedir el agua al dios del agua, que es el apachane en náhuatl, principalmente cuando es temporada de la sequía. Se realiza por 4 días, 3 días de mucho trabajo día y noche, acompañado de música o sones y bailes tradicionales para la petición, conocidos. Bueno, sí. Los 3 días primeros se preparan las flores, coyolxochitl, y recortes de papel en el xochicali o casa de ceremonias.
The image you're seeing right now is for when you're asking for rain. And this ceremony, you ask for rain to the god of the water, which is Apachene in the Nahuatl language. Particularly during the drought season. You do this for 4 days, and it's 3 days, a lot of work, day and night, accompanied by music and traditional dances, while you ask the gods for rain, known as, and this song is known as sones. The three first days, you prepare the flowers, which are the coyolxochitl. Coyolxochitl. I'm so sorry. Coyolxochitl, and you do cutouts of paper in el xochicali, and the person in charge of inviting the community and all the communities and the surroundings so everyone can participate, because it's a ceremony that is can be very expensive and it takes a lot of work, but it's important because we all need the water. And so we can bring something with you to help with the ceremony. ¿Me menciona la siguiente palabra? No, el huilchicatl. Aquí está, sí.
El encargado invita a su comunidad y a otras comunidades a su alrededores para que participen. 1, porque esta ceremonia sale caro y es mucho trabajo. 2, porque todos necesitamos el agua y pueden llevar algo como apoyo en la ceremonia. El huehuetlacatl es el que dirige la ceremonia. El huehuetlacatl es como el hombre sabio. Desde el primer día les dice a la gente qué hacer y cada cuándo se va a hacer algo. Qué tanto de algo, comida, ofrenda, bebidas, flores, velas, o en qué momento copalear en el altar. En el cuarto día se organizan para ir al cerro sagrado y llevan lo que se hizo durante 3 días para dar ofrendas en los 3 altares en el cerro, en la base, en medio y en la cima.
So I got a little bit ahead of myself, but I'm going to repeat it. On the first 3 days, you prepare the flowers, which are the coyolxochitl, and are cutouts with paper in el xochicali, which is the house of ceremonies, and the person in charge invites the community and all the communities around us, because it's a ceremony that is very expensive and it takes a lot of work. And since we all need water, we need to get it done. And we can, so we ask everyone to bring something to help with the ceremony. They were with Tlacatl is the person that is in charge of the ceremony from day one, and so one that tells people what to do and when things are going to get done, and things like and how things as food, drinks, flowers, candles, and when you start using the copal at the ceremony. And then on the fourth day, the people get organized and go to the sacred hill and bring along all the things that were prepared on the 3 days as an offering, and the 3 altars that they built at the hill, at the base, at the middle of it, and at the top.
Otro de las ceremonias es el lavamanos, que Momapaca también es una tradición de la Huasteca veracruzana. Esta se realiza cuando le lavan las manos al padrino del bautizo del hijo o la hija. Entonces también es una ceremonia que lo dirige el Huehuetlacatl y siempre es el copal.
Another ceremony when we the ceremony of washing hands in Nahuatl is called Momopaca. It's a traditional ceremony at the Veracruz Huasteca region, and it's made with it's still active within the indigenous communities for many years now, and it's something that it's passed on from generation to generation. In this ceremony, where the godfather, they wash the hands of the godfather, and during the ceremony, during the baptism ceremony.
Otra del baño del bebé, que recién nacido se tiene que hacer un baño para que su crecimiento sea mejor o como darle esa buena señal de crecer sano. Y en náhuatl decimos maltía conetzi.
¿Dónde está la palabra? No sé cómo. Sí. Another ceremony is when you wash a newborn, is to encourage it to grow healthy and to kind of guide them into growing in a strong manner. And that we call, ¿cómo se llama eso?
Maltía conetzi.
Maltía conetzi. And this shows how deep colonialism has erased our native languages. I'm sorry.
Bueno, y el último que menciona aquí es una de las festividades en la Huasteca como fiesta del año. A lo mejor el término fiesta pues tiene varios conceptos, ¿verdad? Pero en la Huasteca es más como para festejar o esperar a nuestros difuntos que ya no están con nosotros. Entonces también usamos las 3 flores, Sempoalxochitl, Chianxochitl y Cuapelexochitl. Son las flores tradicionales o que se usa mucho en estas fechas. Y aquí en la persona que está es mi esposo, que va por nuestros difuntos como haciendo el camino para llegar al altar, bueno, con la ofrenda y todo. Entonces también usamos el copal, más presente también.
Another ceremony that we do is the celebration of the year. It's hard to directly translate this expression, but it's something that we do every year at the Veracruz Huasteca, and it's a ceremony that we have to welcome and to just greet again our ancestors, those who have passed away. At the image here, you can see that's my husband, and he's creating a pathway to guide our ancestors to come back and visit us. And with that, we use the 3 flowers. ¿Dónde están las flores?
No, es estas.
Las 3 flores, perdón.
No.
¿Me mencionan las 3 flores?
Sempoalxochitl.
Cempasúchil.
Cuapelexochitl.
Cuapelexochitl.
Que es el mano de león. Y Chianxochitl, como flores blancas o flores de lluvia.
The last one is a white or rain flower.
Y bueno, de mi parte es todo. Muchas gracias. Tlaxcamati, gracias.
And that's on my part. Thank you.
Gracias, Sabina and Rebecca. All right, so I will now introduce our final speaker on the panel. Thank you so much, Joela Jacobs. Joela is an associate professor of German studies at the University of Arizona and the founder of the Literary and Cultural Plant Studies Network. which she has maintained for the last decade at plants.arizona.edu. Check it out. Her research focuses on the intersection of 19th to 20th century German literature with plants and animal studies, the environmental humanities, Jewish studies, as well as the histories of sexuality and of science. Her monograph, Animal, Vegetable, Marginal, the German Literary Grotesque from Panizza to Kafka, appeared in Indiana University Press a few weeks ago, and a co-edited volume on plant poetics is forthcoming in July. Please join me in welcoming Joela to the stage.
Yeah, thank you so much. The associate is very recent, just a few weeks since I got tenured. So, thank you. Which means, so I've been told that I can now do all sorts of things, right, and take risks. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of a departure, in some ways, though not in others, from what I usually do with plants, and maybe in a way that is a bit more personal. And so I'm in German studies, so maybe now you're expecting Goethe. We've heard about Goethe in these past days, so I will not talk about him, but maybe connect a little bit to what Rebecca was talking about yesterday, Banu, Elaine this morning, and so forth. All right, just figuring this out. So when German naturalist Alexander von Humboldt explored the so-called Americas at the turn of the 19th century, he and his colleague Aimé Bonpland, as well as many unnamed local people, famously collected a wide range of specimens, but were especially interested in plants. After his return, Humboldt spent over 20 years writing down his findings, making major contributions to many different disciplines. It's a story of quote-unquote exploration, a term that describes a European becoming aware of a world that had existed quite well without their interference. One of the many results of Humboldt's becoming aware was the realization that plants grow in climate zones around the world. What will thrive at a certain latitude and elevation in one place will thrive at a similar latitude and elevation in a different longitude. With this observation of interconnectedness around the globe, Humboldt introduced ecological thinking. My own observation of this interconnectedness also required me to travel to a different climate zone. I am from Germany, and when I began my PhD at the University of Chicago, I observed differences that did not seem very consequential. In other words, the trees, grasses, and flowers in Chicago, while growing on former swampland, did not strike me as fundamentally different from those in Berlin, even if they were different kinds. Yet when I moved to Arizona for my job, I was confronted with entirely different vegetation. Clearly, the climate of the Sonoran Desert could not sustain wild raspberries by the train tracks or daisies mingling with clover in front lawns, which had been present in Chicago, Berlin, and other places I had spent time. Only then did I begin to realize how specific my notion of nature was. The fact that it matched landscape paintings in many museums was a sign of my Eurocentric experiences. It also brought me back to Humboldt, whose work suggested that peoples might be endemic to their climate zones, just like plants. And we see this idea continued in the terminology of nativeness and its flip side, invasion, which are applied to plants and people alike. Humboldt's thinking about people and landscapes had staying power, not only, but nonetheless, particularly in the German mind. When the Nazis introduced their ideas of blood and soil over a century later, they built on an understanding of people thriving only in specific environments and lands. One of their persistent propaganda tropes was the notion of Jews as desert dwellers. They used this idea to undermine Jewish belonging in Germany, and at the same time, they framed their invasion of other lands as a quote-unquote reclaiming of their quote-unquote native, there's going to be a lot of quotation marks, of their quote-unquote native territory. Clear in terminology like the so-called Anschluss of Austria, which presents the annexation of the neighboring country as a reconnecting of a severed portion of the self. Similar rhetoric accompanied invasions of regions to the east with sizable populations of German speakers that had at some point been within the borders of Prussia, Austria, Hungary, and other pre-World War I entities. blood and soil became not just a shorthand for imperial conquest, but also a cultural mantra, as it led to a specific propaganda aesthetic that positioned Germans as forest people. This simplified genealogy connected Nazi Germany directly to the Germanic tribes who, according to this lore, heroically fought the Romans in their forested lands where they worshipped their Germanic gods beside clean streams and under blue skies. A sense of ownership of the so-called German forest, which if you're interested in, Johannes Zechner has written extensively about, emerged that contrasted with the supposed barrenness of the desert-dwelling Jews. Worse, as a diasporic people, Jews were not only presented as beings in the wrong place, but as eternally homeless. The figure of the wandering Jew became a counterpoint to German notions of what is called Heimat, a term denoting home and belonging, with a loaded history both before and since the Nazis. As a current desert dweller, I'm acutely aware of just how wrong this conception of the desert as barren actually is. Yes, at first you might be struck by the amount of quote-unquote dirt and the color brown around you when you come to visit me in Tucson, but that perception quickly changes. I have never known more about the plants around me than when living here, and this is not just because I have been engaging in plant studies. The rarer the vegetation, the more you notice it. Van de Zee and Schussler's dictum of so-called plant blindness is predicated, among other things, on our cognitive inability to see green on green well, especially when there are no quick and sudden movements. Ableist questions about the term aside, there is not much green on green in the desert. Rather, every plant sticks out. And so I notice their presence, their struggle and striving perhaps more readily. When the choyas, ocotillos, and saguaros start blooming, like they're doing right now, I cannot look away. After the monsoon, you cannot just smell petrichor, but the creosotes secreting a distinctive odor after the rare rains. These plants are native to the Sonoran Desert, whether on its US or Mexican side, and they have developed fascinating ways to thrive under somewhat adverse climate circumstances. That makes desert dwellers quite resilient and survivors, and of course the metaphorical implications with all their complications are not lost on you here. After reading about climate zones in Humboldt, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I still was when I realized that one of the plants local to my backyard in Arizona, the prickly pear cactus, is also very common in Israel and Gaza. In fact, it is a contentious symbol that has culinary and cultural meaning for people on both sides. Depending on whom you ask, Arabic sabra or Hebrew sabra, the prickly pear, stands for one of two things. Either the destruction of Palestinian lives and livelihoods, as what is left from many villages are often only the outlines of properties by prickly pear plants, or the Zionist nation and its citizens. And here I give you, one source has it as the ideal Israeli who is born in the country is called a sabra. Tough on the outside like the thorny fruit, soft on the inside like its sweet flesh, and native to the soil like the plant. Except the prickly pear has not always been native to this region. Its origins can be traced back to the so-called Americas, from where it arrived via Spain. I think we can see how complicated these plant and land-based discourses of belonging can get, and they have this in common with ideas of naturalness, as I have explored in my usual work on gender, sexuality, and plants over the years. But let me take you back to this side of the Atlantic. In the settler colonial states of America, we find a constellation of land and people that is particular to those environments. I wrote this talk on the lands of the Tono O'odham and the Pasco Yaqui, coming from the state with the most reservation land in the country. Acknowledging the stewards of this land is common practice at my institution, but it only gains meaning through corresponding actions, and we've heard this today, and that is about returning land. In post-colonial contexts, this has happened to some degree, but in settler colonial contexts, it is much more difficult. While we can debate the complications of all of this, including reparations, which stretch across all of the contexts I have alluded to so far today, what remains clear is that there is an understanding of nativeness operative in settler colonial contexts that ties identity and land inextricably together. Belonging is belonging to the land, and with the land, it extends to people, animals, and plants. When I teach in the Transcultural German Studies MA and dual degree PhD program in Arizona with students from Germany, Kenya, Nigeria, China, and India, just to name a few of the countries of origin of my current graduate course, and I brought them because I had to miss hooding them at graduation, some of them, to be here, so I figured I'd show you where we are next, a photo from last week where we're under some non-native trees that are clearly getting lots of watering. So when I teach in this context, this raises complicated transcultural and multilingual questions about settlers, colonizers, the settled and the colonized, belonging, and the land we are on. Students might ask, why is it okay to connect native belonging to land here, but not in the same way in Germany? How do we disentangle notions like blood and soil from the blood that has been spilled in the struggle over soil? I have no easy answers here. They are right. If I were to speak in Germany of quote-unquote German natives belonging to the land, I would probably be flagged for a hate speech violation, which is the one restriction on free speech in Germany, which is about resurrecting Nazi slogans, ideas, and paraphernalia. Yet when I acknowledge those who belong to the land and to whom the land has belonged since time immemorial, these days it might have consequences too, but when I wrote the abstract for this paper, it was perhaps a less controversial statement that reminded us settlers in the room of our non-belonging. And while I will not unduly dwell on this here, particularly as a white person from a Western nation, I'm also an immigrant to this country, and so together with the privilege of dual citizenship, I also picked up this responsibility for the US past and added it to my German guilt. So perhaps you're missing the plants right now. So let me return to them. In my interdisciplinary work, the plants, animals, and environmental questions always go together with those about identity, be it gender and sexuality, or German Jewish studies, and it's always through the conduit of language. You can see some of my some current collaborative efforts here, and I think collaboration is one of the strengths of plant studies as a field and key to interdisciplinarity. More precisely, I'm interested in more than human poetics, such as zoo and especially phytopoetics, but also in the way tropes circulate alongside the movement of plants and people. A good example of a trope is a word like leaf, because it connects plants and literature directly through language. In German, Blatt is not only a plant part, but also the page we write or read from. And you see this connection in other languages too, feuille in French, or the English term folio, through which you are leafing. In a way, then, a trope is a poetic way of speaking, a term that can be used literally and metaphorically at the same time, with layers of meaning that move through different contexts. Taking on additional meanings is a specialty of poetic language, and webs of intertextual cross-referencing can imbue seemingly simple terms with a host of meaningfulness that is hard to shake. Take the tree, for example. One of the more famous German poems out there in the world is Bertolt Brecht's An die Nachgeborenen, or To Those Born Later, from 1939. The title is already poetic in that Brecht coined a compound term that did not exist like this before, literally meaning to the afterborn, in the sense of to those who follow in our wake. This term shows the capacity of German for compounds or mashing words together to produce new meaning. That part's pretty fun. You have probably all heard Brecht's poem before. It begins, "What times are these in which a conversation about trees is almost a crime? For in doing so, we maintain our silence about so much wrongdoing." Well, here we are, talking about trees. About plants in the middle of a lot of wrongdoing. Is it a crime? And what is almost a crime? We might be wondering these days too. Brecht is writing the poem on the eve of the Second World War, when the persecution of so many people in Germany, Jews, communists, queer and disabled folks, had been ongoing for years. And parallels between this time and our own have been drawn not infrequently lately. already in 1991, and here I have to clarify, if you have read the abstract, it erroneously listed 2016 actually, a year of the publication of this next poem that I'm talking about, but not the year of its writing, perhaps just a year in which the poem became important again to many after Trump was first elected. So in 1991, in the aftermath of the Cold War, the end of the Gulf War, and the filmed police brutality against a black man, Rodney King, that led to the Los Angeles riots, American poet and feminist Adrienne Rich wrote a poem that overtly responds to Brecht's, and she has not been the only one who's done so over the years. In What Times Are These by Rich, the speaker takes us to, quote, a place between two stands of trees where the grass grows uphill, and the old revolutionary road breaks off into shadows near a meeting house abandoned by the persecuted who disappeared into those shadows. Here, the speaker has been picking mushrooms at the edge of dread. But don't be fooled. This isn't a Russian poem. This is not somewhere else, but here, our country moving closer to its own truth and dread, its own ways of making people disappear. The speaker won't tell us where this place, this leaf mold paradise is, because she already knows who wants to buy it, sell it, make it disappear. So why is she telling us anything, the speaker asks. And here Brecht reappears, and we might read the answer as one both to the speaker's question and the titular one that Brecht had first posed about the times. Because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it is necessary to talk about trees. Why is it necessary to talk about trees in times like these? Why is it not almost a crime in Rich's poem? Trees will grab your attention, but botanists and plant study scholars know that plants famously and consistently do not rise to the level of human awareness enough. So how do we square the so-called plant blindness, or rather plant awareness disparity, with this take? It is the poetic baggage of the trope that grabs our attention. These trees are not just trees, they are both trees and a trope, a symbol for something else. And while I'm usually the first to ask for more specificity and attention to actual plants as a plant study scholar, right? Like, which plant? As a literary and cultural scholar, I'm also deeply convinced that there are important lessons from and about plants in tropes and metaphors in the way we speak about and of plants. So the trees in Rich's poem grab our attention because they are Brecht's trees, because they give language to an experience and a feeling that cannot be freely or easily talked about. Speaking about trees has become a trope that also indicates a particular attention economy that seems perhaps familiar to us these days. Speaking about trees means, for instance, teaching whatever it is that we happen to teach. German literature, plant studies, whatever you teach, in the midst of much wrongdoing, as Brecht put it. So on the one hand, speaking about trees is shorthand for ignoring more pressing concerns then. But of course, in the age of climate change, the trees themselves are representatives of one of these pressing concerns. On the other hand, teaching the things we teach, or speaking about trees, is not ignoring these wrongdoings at all. When we turn to history, culture, language, art, religious studies, whatever it is you do, we cannot help but find traces everywhere of those before us who are pointing to the fact that times like these have been here before, many times. We are the ones born after that Brecht's poem is addressing. And while I have cited the beginning of it for you, I have not actually shown you all of it yet. The poem has 3 parts that describe a sense of guilt. By chance I have been spared. If my luck breaks, I am lost. And indeed, in 1941, Brecht had to flee Germany after all. A sense of guilt about, quote, laying down among murderers. And at the end of the poem, it says, "We who wish to lay the foundation for gentleness could not ourselves be gentle. But you, when at last the time comes that man can aid his fellow man, should think upon us with leniency." Even though the poem talks about the many wars, the many iterations that such dark times have already had, the speaker remains optimistic for a different future. In this future, those born after are asked for leniency, Nachsicht, a term denoting understanding and perhaps forgiveness. My reading of this poem has fundamentally changed lately. While I once perhaps naively thought that we had arrived in times where we were the ones to extend such understanding, my comprehension of what Brecht expresses here now no longer feels distant and removed. This level of understanding would must have compelled Adrian Ridge and others to pick up on Brecht's words on his powerful trope of the conversation about trees. So what can plant studies provide in times like these, or what can plants teach us? My co-author, Isabel Kranz, and I foolishly promised suggestions for that in our abstract, and now she can't even be here, in part because of what's happening at the border, so I'm stuck with having to fulfill this promise. So first I want to reiterate that doing plant studies is no less important in times like these. When I finished my just published book, Animal, Vegetal, Marginal, I had to explain in its conclusion, and not for the first time, how I can talk about plants, animals, and marginalized human beings at the same time. Aren't their sufferings drastically different? And haven't people been dehumanized by comparisons to animals, nature, wilderness, and wildness, from chattel slavery to cattle cars? Yes, is my answer. And that is why it is not about a comparison, but about solidarity. Such suffering has been mutually reinforcing, and understanding the history of such entanglements, or embranglements now I want to say, can attune us to their persistence in the present. Whether a human being is called an animal or accused of eating the wrong animal, neither humans nor animals win. But back to plants, you say? Well, notions of naturalness work in similar ways, as I've shown in work like the articles here on the slide. And since we've been hearing about cryptogams like mosses, perhaps I can add a recent piece on asexual ecologies with Nicole Seymour. So in my work on phytopoetics, on how plant reproduction, in this particular case study, how plant reproduction has shaped human notions of sexuality and gender, I have traced the persistence of a myth of naturalness that has worked in similar ways. Just think of how declaring something unnatural relegates it to the realm of deviance, an age-old trick of the morality police that raises big questions about nature and culture. Looking at plants and studying the way we interact with them in history, culture, religion, literature, art, and so forth can therefore equip us and our students with a critical lens onto the tropes that shape our realities. Language matters, and if we say a person is an animal or a behavior is unnatural, it's just as detrimental as saying that a plant is a thing, an object. Looking at how ideas about nature, landscape, climate, plants, and animals have been instrumentalized across the ages, from Humboldt's time to the Nazis to today on both sides of the Atlantic, can give us a sense of the recurrence of times like these, and how talking about trees might be both almost a crime and a necessity in response. These examples also make a particular case for the importance of poetics, here in the form of poems, though that is not all that that means, which take on a weighty additional meaningfulness, but also provide new forms of expression in times like these. So, as a literary and cultural plant studies scholar, I invite you to consider reading a poem, or writing one, or reading and writing some with your students, or reading and writing other literature, like Raske's Book of Delights, about which I've written on the blog for the Thinking with Plants and Fungi initiative, to find your ways of talking about trees in times like these. Danke. And since it was so generously mentioned in the introduction, if you're interested in literary and cultural plant studies, do join the Literary and Cultural Plant Studies Network. It's been lovely that so many of you have come up to tell me that you know my name from filling your inbox. So I'd love to do that for more people. I founded this international and free network 10 years ago to connect scholars through a listserv and assemble resources in the form of bibliography, and the field has since exploded. And on its anniversary, we will not not just celebrate next year, but also reorient and revamp these efforts to fit its new needs. So stay tuned.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.